In the year 1273, on the banks of the Han River in central China, the thunder of massive stone projectiles shattered more than just fortress walls. They shattered the dreams of an empire that had ruled for over 3 centuries. This is the story of Xiangyang, a single city whose fall would seal the fate of the mighty Song Dynasty and open the gates for Mongol domination over all of China. What unfolded here was not merely a siege, but a collision between 2 worlds. On one side stood the Song Dynasty, masters of sophisticated fortification and naval warfare, defending what many considered the most impregnable fortress in medieval Asia. On the other side marched the forces of Kublai Khan, nomadic warriors who had transformed themselves into the most adaptable military machine the world had ever seen. The stakes could not have been higher. Xiangyang was not just another city, it was the key that locked the door to southern China, the final barrier standing between the Mongols and total conquest of the Chinese heartland. For nearly 5 years, these 2 civilizations would clash in one of the longest and most consequential sieges in human history. The outcome would determine whether China would remain under indigenous rule or fall completely under foreign domination for the first time in its long history. To understand why this single fortress held such power over the fate of an entire empire, we must first grasp the geography that made Xiangyang the most strategically vital position in medieval China. The city sat like a giant lock upon the most important waterway system in the empire. The Han River, flowing past Xiangyang's walls, served as the crucial artery connecting the interior provinces to the mighty Yangtze, China's greatest commercial and military highway. Control this junction, and you controlled the movement of armies, supplies, and wealth throughout the southern half of China. The Song Dynasty understood this geography better than anyone. They had invested enormous resources into transforming Xiangyang into what they believed was an impregnable fortress system. The city was surrounded by mountains on 3 sides and protected by the Han River on the 4th, creating a natural stronghold that seemed designed by the gods themselves for defense. But nature alone was not enough. The Song had constructed walls that were 6 to 7 meters thick, encompassing an area 5 kilometers wide. These were not simple barriers, but sophisticated defensive works featuring double-layered entrances designed to trap attacking forces between killing zones. The fortress featured innovations that represented the pinnacle of Chinese military engineering. Massive stockpiles of supplies were cached within the walls, enough to sustain the garrison for years of siege warfare. High towers dotted the perimeter, providing commanding views of the surrounding terrain and platforms for defensive artillery. Each entrance was protected by at least 2 layers of walls, creating deadly bottlenecks where enemy forces would be compressed and slaughtered. The main gates opened onto waterways that were impossible to ford in summer and became treacherous swamps in winter, adding yet another obstacle for any would-be attacker. Xiangyang was linked to its twin city of Fancheng on the opposite riverbank by a pontoon bridge, creating a defensive system that controlled both sides of the Han River. This was not merely a fortress, but a fortress complex that had been designed and refined over decades to withstand the most determined assault. The Song had learned from previous Mongol campaigns and had specifically prepared Xiangyang to endure prolonged bombardment and blockade. Yet for all its strength, Xiangyang faced an enemy unlike any it had been designed to resist. By the 1260s, the Mongol military machine under Kublai Khan had evolved far beyond its origins as a force of nomadic horsemen. These were no longer simple raiders, who struck fast and disappeared into the steppes. They had become masters of adaptation, capable of transforming themselves to meet any military challenge. Where traditional Chinese enemies might have been stopped by Xiangyang's walls and waters, the Mongols brought something entirely different to the battlefield. Kublai Khan's approach to the siege demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of both Chinese geography and the nature of fortress warfare. Rather than simply surrounding the city and waiting for starvation to do the work, he orchestrated a comprehensive campaign that attacked every aspect of Xiangyang's defensive strategy. He constructed a fleet of over 5,000 ships, manned by Chinese sailors who had joined his cause, and used them to establish a complete naval blockade of the Han River system. This was warfare on a scale that dwarfed anything the region had seen before. The Mongol siege strategy involved multiple coordinated elements that revealed their remarkable military sophistication. Counter-fortifications were built to prevent Song relief attempts from reaching the besieged cities. Supply lines were systematically strangled, cutting off the flow of reinforcements and provisions that had sustained previous Chinese fortresses under siege. The Mongols had studied Chinese warfare for decades, and they brought that knowledge to bear against Xiangyang with devastating effectiveness. The siege began in earnest in 1268, and from the very start, it became clear that this would be a contest of wills as much as weapons. The Song forces within Xiangyang were not merely defending a city, they were defending the last great barrier between the Mongols and the heart civilization land of there. Every day they held out was another day for the Song Dynasty to prepare its defenses, gather its armies, and perhaps find some way to turn the tide of this seemingly unstoppable invasion. The defenders of Xiangyang were led by commanders who understood the stakes perfectly. They knew that their fortress was more than stone and timber. It was the symbol of Song resistance and the anchor of their dynasty's survival. The garrison supply carefully had been selected and, with provisions stockpiled to sustain them through years of siege. These were not desperate defenders clinging to a hopeless position, but professional soldiers who believed their walls were strong enough to break the Mongol war machine. For months, the siege settled into a deadly routine. Mongol forces probed the defenses, testing for weaknesses and launching periodic assaults that were repelled by the Song defenders. The massive walls of Xiangyang absorbed bombardment from traditional siege engines, while the garrison struck back with their own artillery and counter-siege weapons. Both sides recognized that they were engaged in a war of attrition, where victory would belong to whoever could maintain their strength and resolve the longest. The Song dynasty's commitment to holding Xiangyang was absolute. Relief expeditions were organized and launched, despite the enormous risks involved in attempting to break through the Mongol blockade. These desperate attempts to resupply and reinforce the fortress revealed both the strategic importance of Xiangyang and the growing desperation of the Song court as the siege dragged on month after month. But the Mongols were patient, and they were learning. Every failed Song relief attempt taught them more about Chinese tactics and defensive strategies. Every month of siege warfare gave them additional experience in the specialized techniques required to crack the strongest fortifications in the world. The nomadic warriors who had once conquered through speed and mobility were transforming themselves into masters of siegecraft, and Xiangyang was their greatest classroom. The psychological warfare intensified as both armies dug in for what everyone now recognized would be a prolonged struggle. The Song defenders looked out from their towers each morning to see the Mongol encampment stretching to the horizon, a sea of banners and smoke that seemed to grow larger with each passing week. To the Mongols, the sight of Xiangyang's defiant walls rising from the mist became a daily reminder that their reputation for swift conquest had met its match. Yet beneath the surface of this apparent stalemate, the true nature of the siege was revealing itself. This was not simply a contest between attackers and defenders, but a race against time. The Song dynasty needed Xiangyang to hold long enough for the imperial court to organize a massive relief effort or negotiate some form of settlement. The Mongols needed to crack the fortress before their own resources were exhausted or other enemies took advantage of their commitment to this single objective. The first major test of Song resolve came in the autumn of 1269, when a relief force of 3,000 men attempted to break through the Mongol naval blockade under cover of darkness. Led by commanders both named Zhang, this desperate gambit represented everything that made Chinese warfare so formidable and so tragic. The relief fleet consisted of 100 paddle-wheel boats, their crews navigating by lantern light through treacherous waters where a single mistake meant death or capture. The night battle that followed illuminated the Han River with flashes of fire as the two fleets clashed in the darkness. Song forces unleashed volleys from fire lances and crossbows, their projectiles streaking across the water like falling stars. Firebombs exploded against Mongol vessels, sending cascades of sparks into the night sky. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance as Chinese seamanship and desperation battled against Mongol numbers and tactical superiority. Against all odds, the Zhang commanders succeeded in their impossible mission. Their battered fleet reached Xiangyang's walls, delivering precious supplies and reinforcements to the grateful garrison. The sight of Song banners arriving from the river sent cheers echoing from the fortress walls, a sound that carried across the water to the Mongol camps like a challenge thrown in their faces. For a brief moment, it seemed that Chinese ingenuity and courage might yet prevail against the foreign invaders. But the Mongols were quick learners, and they would not be caught off guard again. When the surviving relief force attempted to break out of Xiangyang months later, they found their enemies ready and waiting. The Mongols had learned from their previous encounter, positioning fire-bearing straw along the riverbanks to illuminate the water and deny their opponents the cover of darkness. The night itself became a weapon as the Han River was transformed into a killing ground lit by flickering flames. The second battle was a massacre. Song vessels were caught in the open water, their crews exposed and vulnerable under the artificial daylight created by the burning straw. Mongol archers poured volleys into the trapped boats, while cavalry units positioned along the shore cut down anyone who managed to reach land. One of the Zhang commanders was killed in the fighting, his death marking the end of Song hopes for relieving Xiangyang through naval operations. The failure of these relief attempts sent shockwaves through the Song court and marked a turning point in the siege. The defenders of Xiangyang now understood that they were truly on their own, cut off from the outside world by an enemy that had proven capable of adapting to any challenge. The psychological impact was devastating as the garrison watched their final lifeline to the empire severed before their eyes. Inside the fortress, supplies that had seemed endless began to show signs of depletion. The massive stockpiles that were supposed to sustain the defenders for years were being consumed more quickly than anticipated, partly due to the increased garrison from the relief attempts, and partly due to the stress of constant siege warfare. Rationing became necessary, then severe, as commanders struggled to balance the need to maintain fighting strength with the reality of dwindling resources. The Song court, hundreds of miles away in their southern capital, faced an impossible dilemma. Every month that Xiangyang held out was precious time gained for the dynasty's survival, but every month also brought the fortress closer to inevitable surrender. Attempts to organize another relief expedition met with resistance from generals who had witnessed the fate of the Zhang commanders and were reluctant to sacrifice more troops in what appeared to be a hopeless cause. Meanwhile, the Mongols were facing their own challenges. The siege was consuming enormous resources and tying down forces that could have been used elsewhere. Kublai Khan's other enemies were watching the situation carefully, some perhaps hoping that the Chinese fortress would bleed the Mongol war machine dry. The pressure to achieve results was mounting, not just from the Khan himself, but from the broader Mongol leadership who questioned whether this single city was worth such an enormous investment. It was during this period of mutual exhaustion that events far from the siege lines would determine Xiangyang's fate. In the distant lands of the Middle East, Mongol forces under Hulagu Khan had been perfecting siege techniques against the great cities of Islam. The destruction of Baghdad had taught them lessons about fortress warfare that went far beyond anything they had learned in China. Most importantly, they had encountered siege engines of devastating power that could reduce even the strongest walls to rubble. The counterweight trebuchet represented a revolution in siege warfare that the Chinese had never experienced. Unlike the traction trebuchets familiar to Song engineers, these massive machines used counterweights to generate forces that dwarfed anything previously seen on Asian battlefields. They could hurl projectiles weighing hundreds of pounds across distances that placed them beyond the range of defensive artillery. Most crucially, they were accurate enough to target specific sections of wall with systematic precision. When word reached Kublai Khan that such weapons existed and that Muslim engineers familiar with their construction were available, he immediately grasped their potential. The siege of Xiangyang had reached a stalemate that conventional weapons could not break. But these new engines offered the possibility of victory through sheer destructive power. The Khan's decision to summon these engineers from Persia would prove to be one of the most consequential choices in Chinese history. The arrival of Ismail and Ala al-Din in the Mongol camp during the winter of 1272 marked the beginning of the end for Xiangyang. These Muslim engineers brought with them not just technical knowledge, but a completely different approach to siege warfare. Where Chinese and Mongol siegecraft had focused on patience and attrition, these new weapons promised swift and total destruction of any fortification. The construction of the counterweight trebuchets proceeded with methodical precision throughout the winter months. These were not simple catapults, but sophisticated machines that required precise engineering and careful calibration. The Mongol forces watched in fascination as the Muslim engineers assembled weapons unlike anything they had ever seen. Massive wooden frameworks that towered above the surrounding landscape like mechanical mountains. The first test of these revolutionary siege engines came not against Xiangyang itself, but against its twin city of Fancheng on the opposite bank. The engineers had chosen their target carefully, recognizing that a demonstration of their weapons' power would have as much psychological impact as physical destruction. In December of 1272, the massive trebuchets were wheeled into position, their counterweights calibrated with mathematical precision that amazed even the experienced Mongol commanders. When the first projectile launched, witnesses described a sound like thunder rolling across the earth. The stone, weighing over 300 pounds, arced through the winter sky with devastating accuracy before crashing into Fancheng's walls with earth-shaking force. The impact sent tremors through the ground that could be felt in Xiangyang across the river, announcing to both cities that warfare itself had fundamentally changed in the space of a single moment. The walls of Fancheng, which had withstood years of conventional bombardment, began to crumble under the relentless pounding of the counterweight trebuchets. Each projectile struck with the force of a small earthquake, sending cascades of stone and mortar tumbling into the defensive ditches below. The Song defenders, who had grown confident in their fortification strength, watched in horror as centuries of engineering expertise proved useless against this new form of destruction. Within days, the walls of Fancheng had been systematically demolished. The trebuchets worked with methodical precision, targeting weak points identified by the Muslim engineers until entire sections of the fortress collapsed inward upon themselves. The defenders, trapped behind crumbling ramparts, faced a choice between certain death from the continuing bombardment or surrender to an enemy who had just demonstrated the futility of resistance. The massacre that followed Fancheng's fall was as calculated as the bombardment that preceded it. Kublai Khan ordered that every defender be put to the sword, their bodies displayed along the riverbank, where they could be clearly seen from Xiangyang's walls. This was not merely vengeance but psychological warfare of the most sophisticated kind. The message to the remaining fortress was unmistakable. This fate awaited any who continued to resist the inevitable. Across the Han River, the garrison of Xiangyang watched the destruction of their sister city with growing dread. The sounds of slaughter carried on the wind, mingling with the groans of the great trebuchets as they were carefully disassembled for transport. The defenders knew that their turn was coming, that the same engines which had reduced Fancheng to rubble would soon be trained upon their own walls. The winter months passed in ominous preparation as the Mongol engineers supervised the movement of their siege engines across the frozen river. Every component had to be ferried across with painstaking care, for these were not weapons that could be easily replaced if damaged. The trebuchets represented cutting-edge military technology, each one worth more than entire armies of conventional troops. By the first weeks of 1273, the counterweight trebuchets stood arrayed before Xiangyang's southeastern corner, like mechanical giants preparing for battle. The Muslim engineers had positioned them with scientific precision, calculating angles and distances with an accuracy that left nothing to chance. The defenders atop the walls could see the massive wooden arms being tested and calibrated, knowing that each adjustment brought their doom closer to mathematical certainty. The first shot fired against Xiangyang's walls produced a sound that chroniclers described as thunder splitting the heavens. The projectile, nearly 200 pounds of carefully shaped stone, struck a tower with such force that the entire structure shuddered from foundation to battlements. In the mass, cracks appeared instantly, spider webbing outward from the point of impact like frozen lightning. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. For years, the defenders of Xiangyang had drawn strength from the seeming invincibility of their walls. These fortifications had been their sanctuary, the physical manifestation of their belief that Chinese engineering could overcome any foreign threat. Now, in the space of a single thunderclap, that confidence was shattered as completely as the stone that tumbled from the damaged tower. Panic spread through the garrison faster than the cracks spreading through their walls. Soldiers who had stood firm against conventional siege engines for nearly 5 years now found themselves facing weapons that rendered their fortifications meaningless. The great walls of Xiangyang, which had seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves, were revealed to be as fragile as pottery before the hammer of the counterweight trebuchets. The bombardment continued with relentless precision throughout the following days. Each shot was carefully aimed to maximize both structural damage and psychological impact. Towers crumbled under the assault, sending avalanches of stone cascading into the courtyards below. The drum tower, symbol of Xiangyang's defiance, was reduced to a pile of rubble that blocked one of the main thoroughfares through the city. Inside the fortress, desperate messengers were dispatched to the Song court with pleas for immediate relief. These brave souls had to slip through Mongol lines under cover of darkness, racing southward with news that Xiangyang's situation had become hopeless unless massive reinforcements arrived within days. The journey itself was a suicide mission, as Mongol patrols scoured the countryside for anyone attempting to escape the doomed fortress. One messenger succeeded in reaching the imperial court, his arrival causing consternation among the Song leadership, who had been clinging to hope that Xiangyang could hold out indefinitely. The emperor's response revealed the tragic reality of the dynasty's position. Upon hearing descriptions of the trebuchets' effectiveness, the court concluded that Xiangyang was already lost, and that sending reinforcements would only result in more troops being captured or killed. This abandonment by their own government was perhaps the cruelest blow of all for the defenders of Xiangyang. They had endured years of siege, surviving on dwindling supplies and fading hope, sustained by the belief that their sacrifice mattered to the empire they served. Now they learned that their emperor had written them off as expendable, leaving them to face their fate alone against weapons that made resistance futile. The final days of the siege took on an almost ceremonial quality, as both sides recognized that the outcome was no longer in doubt. The trebuchets continued their methodical destruction of Xiangyang's defenses, while Mongol commanders prepared for the fortress's inevitable surrender. Terms were quietly discussed through intermediaries, with Kublai Khan demonstrating his political sophistication by offering generous conditions to encourage capitulation rather than forcing a costly final assault. Wenhuan, the commander of Xiangyang, faced the most difficult decision of his military career. He could order his men to fight to the death, following the example of countless Chinese heroes who had chosen honor over survival. Such a choice would ensure his place in history as a patriotic martyr, but would also condemn every soldier under his command to certain death. Alternatively, he could surrender and preserve the lives of his men while accepting the shame of defeat. The choice became clear when a Mongol commander approached the walls under a flag of truce. Arik Kaya, a Uyghur general in Kublai's service, called out to Wenhuan with words that combined respect for his opponent's courage with a stark assessment of military reality. The resistance had been skillful and determined, bringing honor to the defenders, but continued fighting would only result in the same massacre that had befallen Fancheng. On March 14th, 1273, after nearly 5 years of siege, Wenhuan made his decision. The gates of Xiangyang opened not to attacking armies but to negotiators carrying terms of surrender that were remarkably generous by the standards of medieval warfare. The defenders would be spared, the civilian population protected, and Wenhuan himself would be retained as governor under Yuan administration. The surrender of Xiangyang sent shockwaves throughout the Song Empire that reverberated far beyond its immediate military significance. News of the fortress's fall spread like wildfire through the river valleys and mountain passes of southern China, carrying with it a message that seemed to render further resistance pointless. If Xiangyang, the strongest fortress in the empire, could not withstand the Mongol war machine, what hope did lesser fortifications have? The psychological impact proved as devastating as the military consequences. Song commanders throughout the empire looked at their own walls and wondered if they too would crumble before the thunder of counterweight trebuchets. The very weapons that had brought down Xiangyang became symbols of Mongol technological superiority, their reputation spreading faster than the armies that wielded them. Wenhuan's decision to cooperate with his Mongol conquerors created a cascade effect that accelerated the dynasty's collapse. As a respected commander with family members leading other Song garrisons, his defection carried enormous weight among the military class. When he sent messages to his relatives urging them to surrender rather than face destruction, many chose to follow his example rather than endure pointless sieges. The Yangtze River system, which had been the Song Dynasty's greatest natural defense, now became a highway for Mongol conquest. With Xiangyang's fall, the river routes lay open to Kublai Khan's fleets, allowing them to project power deep into the heart of Chinese territory. Fortress after fortress surrendered without fighting, as their commanders recognized the futility of resistance against enemies who possessed weapons capable of reducing any wall to rubble. The strategic revolution unleashed by Xiangyang's fall extended far beyond military considerations to reshape the very nature of political power in medieval China. For centuries, Chinese dynasties had relied on fortress systems and natural barriers to maintain control over their vast territories. The counterweight trebuchet had rendered that entire defensive philosophy obsolete in the space of a few months, forcing a complete rethinking of how empires could be defended and maintained. The echoes of Xiangyang's fall rippled across the centuries, marking not just the end of a siege but the death of an entire world. The Song Dynasty, which had ruled China for over 300 years, would collapse within 6 years of losing their great fortress. The counterweight trebuchets that shattered Xiangyang's walls had done more than destroy stone and mortar. They had shattered the illusion that any fortification, no matter how sophisticated, could stand against the relentless tide of technological innovation. Kublai Khan's victory at Xiangyang demonstrated the terrible power of adaptation in warfare. The nomadic horsemen who had once conquered through speed and mobility had transformed themselves into masters of siegecraft, naval warfare, and political manipulation. They had learned to think like their enemies, to understand their weaknesses, and to turn Chinese strengths against themselves. The siege engines that brought down the fortress were not Mongol inventions, but weapons borrowed from their Islamic campaigns and wielded with devastating effectiveness against Chinese walls. The story of Xiangyang reminds us that in the great game of empires, no advantage is permanent. The Song Dynasty had built what they believed was an impregnable fortress, only to watch it crumble before weapons they had never imagined. The Mongols had created the largest land empire in human history, yet within a century their own dynasty would fall to new challengers who had learned from their example. Today, as we face our own technological revolutions and shifting balances of power, the Siege of Xiangyang stands as a testament to a timeless truth. No wall is too high, no fortress too strong, no empire too mighty to fall when the winds of change begin to blow. The thunder of those ancient trebuchets still echoes in our modern world, reminding us that the only constant in history is change itself.